Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder, coming to you from the Peach Gallery in downtown Toronto. Today on The Point, as the mercury drops, Ontarian consumption of energy rises. The Toronto District School Board gets a political shakeup, and we take you inside Queen's Park to see what's happening in the 41st session. All this and more on The Point. Electricity use peaks twice daily, when people get up in the morning and when they come home from work. This week, Kathleen Wynne and Philip Couillard signed an unprecedented deal to swap electricity during these peak hours. As a result, starting in 2015, Ontario and Quebec will exchange 500 megawatts of electricity. Ontario will provide to Quebec in the winter when demand peaks there, and Quebec will provide Ontario in the summer when we see the greatest demand for electricity. We're joined today with Scott Travers, President of the Society of Energy Professionals, IFPTE 160. Thank you for joining us, Scott, today.
Thanks for having me, Marcel.
Scott, a lot of Ontarians are very concerned about the rising cost of electricity. It's an issue that's been going on for a number of years, and we have some big ticket items that the province and ratepayers and taxpayers are going to be facing, including the refurbishment of our nuclear fleet. Can you tell us what you think are some of the important issues around energy and specifically electricity?
Thanks for asking that, Marcel. And electricity is a vital commodity for all of us, and certainly we understand the rising costs are an issue for everybody, especially lower income and fixed income people. I think one of the things we have to remember, though, in the electricity sector is we're making investments in our future. This is infrastructure money, in particular when we talk about nuclear refurbishments, because one of the things about nuclear is the costs tend to be very high up front. It's very capital intensive to do the upfront work, but then the operating costs tend to be very low. So when the total ticket price for a nuclear refurbishment seems very high, but spread over the number of years that the plant operates and the massive amount of power it puts out, it's actually quite cost reasonable.
What other areas do we need to look at in terms of investing in our electrical system? What about the grid and other areas?
Well, certainly there's investment required throughout the system. The transmission system is getting older. A lot of the wires on the system have aged significantly, and there's significant amounts of money have to be spent to modernize, both replace aging systems, but also to modernize the system and bring new technologies into place, and to expand the system to bring clean, renewable, reliable power throughout the province. So there will be large investments required in the transmission system as well.
Now, talking about rates, the Ontario Power Generation made an application for an increase in rates recently, and that was denied by the Ontario Energy Board. What impact will that have?
That's a good point. First off, it wasn't denied. What the Ontario Energy Board did was reduce the rate that they were willing to offer to pay for Ontario Power Generation. And it's a significant issue for the province. Certainly in the short term, that will reduce costs for the ratepayers. But we need to look at the longer term impact of a decision like that. Anyone who owns a car or owns a house can understand that if you don't do your investment up front in the short run, you can save some money, but you really need to be careful that you're not going to end up paying more in the long run for that kind of decision. Ontario Power Generation is already the lowest cost generator in Ontario, and we know that Ontario Power Generation, if they were getting the same cost per megawatt of electricity that the average of other generators were getting, electricity prices would be 30% higher than they are now. So one of the things the public doesn't understand, it's not being talked about, is OPG hasn't had a rate increase since 2008. So while costs have been going up in Ontario for electricity, it hasn't been because of OPG. They've in fact had their rates frozen for 6 years now. And so it's difficult. Our concern is that what the OEB is doing in this rate process is actually going to damage the long-term viability of the Ontario power generation. And since OPG has been doing a tremendous job in mitigating rates within Ontario, the concern is that if their long-term viability gets jeopardized, we'll have to turn to other higher cost forms of generation in the long run.
Now, the province had a commission that's headed by Ed Clark study different options for making investments more efficient. And one of the areas that they looked at was OPG and Hydro One. Could you discuss some of those areas that they've talked about?
Sure, thanks. Yeah. The Clark Commission is kind of a mixed bag. They did some things very well, and we agree with some of their recommendations, but we have some issues with some of what their interim report said.
Such as?
Well, just on the good side, I want to point out they did an excellent job in talking to stakeholders. We met with them. We know they met with other stakeholders, and they ran a very good process that way. But we do have some issues with a couple of the recommendations they made. We don't support the interim recommendation of splitting off the distribution piece of Hydro One and separating it from the transmission piece. The point of the process was to look for value for Ontario consumers. We're also concerned about the reliability impact in northern communities in particular, where distribution and transmission operate so closely together, and we're concerned that it'll have a negative impact on the long term.
Scott, we have just a minute left in our time, and you touched on policy. One of the policies of the previous, I guess, still Liberal government was to introduce the Green Energy Act and to put more emphasis on renewable energy. How is that working out, and what impact is that having?
Well, I think it's fair to say it's not working out as well as it could have. And when you go back and look at the objective of doing that was to reduce CO2 emissions. And again, we didn't have the full discussion and investigation that we should have had. Ontario is a different jurisdiction than many. In Ontario, the transportation sector is the largest producer of CO2, not the energy sector. Even before we shut down our coal plants, we had a very clean electricity sector in Ontario because of our baseload hydro and our nuclear power. And so it's not clear that we got the best bang for our buck by investing in renewables in the energy sector. We may have done better by making larger investments in our transportation sector and in transit. But because we didn't do the kind of evidence-based planning process that would have done that analysis, we don't really know if we got the best value for our dollar through the Green Energy Act.
Thank you so much, Scott. Scott Travers, President of the Society of Energy Professionals.
Thanks, Marcel.
Up next on The Point, we take you back to school. Welcome back to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder. The Toronto District School Board has seen a major political shift. In the October elections, 6 incumbents lost their seats, creating a new and more diverse board. With over half of the trustees being new faces, voters have clearly shown their dissatisfaction with the previous board. I'm joined with newly elected trustee for Eglinton Lawrence, Jennifer Arp. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Jennifer, it's been a tumultuous year at the TDSB. We've seen a trustee charged for unlawful confinement. We've had deals with China blowing up. We've had any number of issues. Really, what are the things that you see as being important in order to restore confidence back in the TDSB?
Right. I think, one of the great things is that I'm one of 11 new trustees coming on to the board, where half the board is new, and that provides a tremendous opportunity to work together, to collaborate, and to hopefully work to restoring public confidence in the TDSB, to push for more transparent decisions, and to really move forward in a positive way that benefits the well-being of the students.
So you're one of 11 new trustees you just mentioned. What are your priorities for the upcoming session?
Right. I've come to this from pretty active involvement as a parent in the Model Schools for Inner City program. the equity file is extremely important to me. I really want to push that. You see a lot when you have children in a model school. You see the flaws in the system, the lack of parent engagement, and that impacts student achievement. And I would hope that through the development of a model schools, the expansion of the model schools program into a proper inner city department, that we're able to reach more children to bring greater equity to the system. I also hope with the ward that I'm representing to be able to bridge that gap between sort of the schools that are more well off versus the schools that aren't. It's something that I believe is really important when all students are working together, when all students see that not everyone has as much as others. That creates better citizens of the world moving forward.
You mentioned model schools. Can you describe a little bit more detail? Because a lot of people may not be familiar with model schools. So
Right. The Model Schools for Inner City program is a group of 150 schools. All of the schools in the TDSB are ranked on something called the Learning Opportunities Index. The lower the number, the higher the need. And so the numbers from 1 to 150 are the schools that form the Model Schools for Inner City program.
Mm-hmm. And do they receive additional funding or resources?
They do, to make up the gap, because they just do not have the ability to fundraise in the same way that other schools do. So they do receive additional funding. There are education modules that the teachers present to the class. Mm-hmm. They have there's partnership with Walmart to provide glasses and vision clinics for the students. There's health services that come in. There's money for parent engagement and opportunities for parents to bring them into the school, because parents really are an important part of children's education.
Talking about parents are really concerned about the quality of education that their kids are getting, that it's preparing them for going into post-secondary or going into vocational trades or whatever they choose. Is the system now at the level it's at able to deliver that type of service that they need?
Right. I think the system is pretty good at helping children go to university. I don't think that they're doing a really great job with giving them the tools for the modern 21st century world. There's not a lot of training on entrepreneurial skills. They're not using technology to the level that they could be. There's an emphasis that you need to actually have a physical textbook in front of you, but the TDSB needs to be looking at other options for using technology and showing students that there are other ways of doing things and preparing students for a more global economy.
It's a very interesting point that technology is now changing the landscape and how we learn and what we learn. And there's been more emphasis on that. But because of budgetary constraints, the TDSB isn't able to keep up with that. How are you going to be able to do that?
Right. One of the first things that the new board will have to do is enter budget process for this year. It essentially starts right away. There's a large opportunity for us to look at what's going on that level. I think that technology doesn't necessarily need to be expensive. The resources are there. It's how do we go about finding them, or how do we tap into teachers that are already using what's out there and bring them to the board so that they can educate their colleagues on what is going on, on the internet, web-based learning, things like that. And that will hopefully be able to relieve some of the pressure on the budget in terms of textbooks and other things moving forward.
We're seeing more schools closing because of declining enrollment.
Right.
And yet, the number of dollars is actually increased, but you have less kids. How do you balance that point out?
In my ward, we've got 3 main high schools, one of which is at 150% capacity, and the other 2 are well below where they should be. And part of it is public perception, right? You've got a lot of really desirable schools and desirable neighborhoods, and how do we take the load off of those schools and funnel them into schools that really have amazing things happening in order to be able to keep them open to service their community? Because when you're forced to close a school, you're taking something away from the community. And oftentimes the schools that are forced to shut down are in neighborhoods that need that core more than anywhere else.
You were a champion in your community to prevent the sale of land from the TDSB to private interests.
Right.
In a school that is not being used currently, but being rented out to another school. How are you able to justify keeping that property within the TDSB?
Right. Well, with that situation, there are a number of factors, one of which is the process that the board developed to decide whether a property was going to be sold or severed wasn't followed correctly, or we can't trace how it was the process that was followed. The other thing that I think is important to look at is that nobody's ever asked any questions. Well, what if the TDSB took over looking after the green space and charged a line item on the lease from the school that's currently using the school? The Catholic school down the road is only on 2 acres. So offering space to them during the day so that they can walk over and use the green space, as well as charging proper permit fees to the sports clubs that are currently using the field and getting it at a greatly reduced rate because the Montessori school is being so generous at letting them use it.
That's an interesting point that you raised. I mean, getting better value out of existing properties.
Right.
What other areas would you like to see the TDSB explore in terms of being able to monetize some of its underperforming assets?
One of the things that the TDSB could be looking at is, what if the lease was only a Monday to Friday? What if the lease, only included the gym from 8 till 5, and then the TDSB was free to permit the gym in the evenings and on the weekends, right? It's how do we work with our lease partners in a better way to try and come up with more creative solutions and ways to generate revenue so that we can maintain the properties that we have, we can keep what we have, but be able to fund capital repairs and things that need to happen.
Those are all excellent points. I'm going to look forward after December the 2nd, is it, that you're sworn in?
December 1st.
December 1st, okay. And hopefully we'll have you back on again and give us an update on how things are at the TDSB. I was joined with Jennifer Arp, the trustee-elect of Eglinton Lawrence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up next on The Point, Craig Hughson from Aurora Strategy Group is back with more on the Ontario Legislature. Welcome back to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder. The session of the 41st Legislature resumed on October 20th, and while it's only been a few weeks, there's been plenty of news coming from Queen's Park. Finance Minister Charles Sousa delivered his economic update. NDP MPP Joe Semita resigned from his Sudbury riding. And at the latest NDP convention, leader Andrea Horwath only drew 76% support. I'm joined with Craig Hughson from Aurora Strategy Group. Craig, thanks for being back. A lot happening at Queen's Park over the last couple of weeks, starting off with the Finance Minister's economic statement. Can you give us a couple of highlights from that?
Well, it started off with a little bit of bad news in that the Ontario government missed their economic forecast for this year. And then Sousa tries to gloss over that with his latest attack on Ottawa to try and get more money for infrastructure, the Ring of Fire.
Revenue seems to be a key item with the government. They aren't getting as much as they need to. They seem in this economic statement to want to focus in on the black market, people who aren't paying their fair share of taxes. What steps are they looking at?
Well, they've tried this before. I know Minister Duncan, as finance minister a couple of years ago, went down this road in a budget or an economic statement as well. And they're going to go after tax cheats. They want to find people that aren't offering full disclosure on their salaries and the black market construction and others, as well as contraband tobacco seems to be high on their agenda. They're looking to get $700 million annually from these measures to make up for their economic shortcomings. Otherwise, Deb Matthews has a really tough job finding savings in the OPS.
Well, then there's been some discussion about Ontario introducing its own form of a carbon tax, so similar to what BC and Quebec currently have.
Well, there was a little bit of rumbling about that, and then it really went mainstream when Ontario and Quebec had a joint cabinet meeting last week and signed a couple of partnership deals. One of them was on setting a carbon price, which I think is certainly going to get us to that carbon tax here in Ontario sooner rather than later. I would expect to see something in the budget, and we're probably going to hear a little bit more musing and trial balloons on this topic over the coming weeks.
And we've been hearing some musing about Ontario companies have been making record profits and leaving that money in the bank. Basically, it's dead money. And there's been a movement afoot to get people to get off the sidelines, invest that money in increased productivity through new machinery, training, etc. And the government is looking at possibly taxing that profit that's sitting in the banks doing nothing now.
Well, I think they're going to go with two approaches to that, a carrot and a stick. The carrot would be to offer tax credits for research and development and people to use that money and incent people to use it. And then if that's not working, then use the stick to tax people that are in businesses that are using are leaving large chunks of money not participating in Ontario's economy.
So lots happening on the government side. Let's now go over to the opposition side. And last week, Andrea Horwath faced the music at her convention. And she received 76% approval rating. So they're not going to call a leadership convention for the NDP. But there were a lot of disgruntled members of the party who basically sat on their hands during Andrea's speech. How is that playing out within the NDP?
Well, we did see a very interesting convention for the NDP, and the unhappy voices in the party made an awful lot of noise. I think that the date and time for Andrea to ever try another tack to the right like she did in the past election is definitely behind her. She has a huge debt to pay to her new chief of staff, who stepped up to the microphone and delivered a fantastic speech to the delegates at the convention. And a lot of people said even better than her own speech. And that might have brought swayed the voters that may have been less than enthused with Andrea to stay the course.
Finally, we've got just a minute or so to wrap up. I'd like to talk about what's happening on the Conservative side. It seems that all the candidates are now in place for the Tory leadership. Well, I don't know, but it's getting close to the final wire for declaring. And so we've got at least half a dozen candidates. How would you handicap the race at this point?
Well, we do have, I think, 3 front runners, if I could handicap it that, although we do have the big elephant that may or may not be in the room, which is Doug Ford. And he plans to make it a decision in the very near future. But right now, I think Vic Fideli and Christine Elliott are the 2 front runners. Although the one we are likely to hear a lot about over the next couple weeks and months as the campaign goes on is Lisa MacLeod, who is not shy by any stretch and will likely get a lot of media attention just for her bombastic approach and ability to make some interesting statements.
Well, we'll have to watch and see what happens. We'll have you back on our next show, and we'll see how the race progresses. Craig Hughson from Aurora Strategy Group, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Marcel. Good to be here.
We'll be right back with a final thought on The Point. It's the most common topic of conversation among Canadians after hockey. It's the weather. It's the perfect icebreaker we love to complain about, joke about, and get mad about. There is something about Canada's relationship with the weather that is unique compared to others. But with the early blast of winter we received, the weather reminded us that she calls the shot, no matter how much we talk about it. Canadians, like the rest of the world, are experiencing profound climate change. From deadly flood in Alberta to the ice storm that gripped central Canada and brought Toronto to a halt, our planet is trying to tell us something. According to the latest UN report on climate change, the average level of atmospheric carbon is nearly 400 parts per million. We haven't seen that type of number since Homo erectus was roaming around foraging for food and shelter. Scientists warn that once we hit the 400 parts per million threshold, we can expect to see even more dramatic changes. One example is that the rising temperatures will cause more of the polar ice cap to melt, thereby increasing the level of the seas. With more than half of the world's population living within 100 miles of a coast, this could have catastrophic impact. Despite these warnings, our federal government continues to stick its head in the sand and ignore the signs. Both China and the US have staked out an agreement to curb carbon emissions over the next 20 years. But that's not enough. All countries need to pull their weight. Canada, as one of the largest producers of CO2 emissions per capita, needs to step up and be a leader, not a laggard. In Ontario, the government changed the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in recognition of the importance of this issue. BC and Quebec have introduced a carbon tax, and other provinces are promoting measures to reduce carbon emissions and their impact on climate change. The time is now for the federal government to toss its talking points, pack up the climate change deniers, and get with the program. If we ever want to have any hope for leaving this planet a bit better for our kids and future generations of Canadians, then we need action, not denial. And that's the point. And that's it for this edition of The Point. Catch us next on December 15th. Follow us on Twitter at WatchThePoint, like us on Facebook, and check out our podcast at watchthepoint.libsyn.com. I'm Marcel Wieder. Thank you for watching.